Donald Trump won the presidency with a crystal clear brand: strength, winning, deal-making to fix a broken Washington. In the health care push that collapsed Friday, he was too weak to sway fellow Republicans. He lost. He could not close the deal he promised from day one of his campaign.
We have to repeal Obamacare, and it can be replaced, and it can be replaced with something much better for everybody. Let it be for everybody, but much better and much less expensive for people and for the government, and we can do it. So I've watched the politicians. I've dealt with them all my life. If you can't make a good deal with a politician, then there's something wrong with you. You're certainly not very good.
After a certainly not very good experience and week, the president wants to turn the page.
It certainly was an interesting period of time. We all learned a lot. We learned a lot about loyalty. We learned a lot about the vote-getting process. We learned a lot about some very arcane rules in, obviously, both the Senate and in the House. So it's been, certainly for me, it's been a very interesting experience.
So let's start there. What did he learn?
Well, this is not the first time that President Trump has been tripped up by the written or unwritten rules of politics. I mean, remember, he lost a popular vote. His initial ban on travel from these Muslim countries. He lost his choice for labor secretary, his army secretary pick. I mean, so this is definitely not his first loss. But he did learn a lot about loyalty and who he can trust. It's very true.
But, John, it's so hard to overstate how significant of a loss this is. I mean, the Republican base, the party, has been clamoring for this for 7 years. This has been their central campaign promise. The real ramifications, he's ready to move on. Donald Trump is ready to move on. The question is the Republican base ready to move on? Do they believe that it's time to give up on repealing and replacing Obamacare less than 3 months into a new administration? And if they can't ever do anything this Congress, which they probably won't, what will that mean for 2018, keeping control of the House? And now there are significant fears of keeping control of the Senate because the base could be depressed and may not come out to support them if they can't deliver the central promise.
And we know from the campaign and from the president that Donald Trump's a transactional person. So he wants to turn the page, move on. That didn't work. I'm not touching that again. Let's just move on and go. But the question is, what lesson did they learn? You can say you're going to move on, but if you've blown the road full of potholes and you have no tires and there's questions about the engine, moving on, you got to fix the car first.
No doubt. And overhauling the tax system, any tax reform now is so much more difficult and more expensive. It's the whole shebang here. But I'm told there were meetings over the weekend in the White House to still look at health care. They are moving on in the short term, but they know this is still this big albatross that hangs over the party. And Monty was right about 2018. Republicans will demand that they do something. And Mike Pence, the vice president, was in West Virginia on Saturday still talking about repealing and replacing Obamacare.
And he said it was a victory for the status quo. The whole raison d'etre of Donald Trump's campaign for president was to fix this town and to end the status quo. His own vice president saying, the status quo wins.
I think there are two real lessons or concerns that emerge from this. One is credibility, and the other is the fear factor, the power factor, right? President Trump's credibility is seriously jeopardized by what happened. And so perhaps is his ability to scare people in the future into doing what he wants.
In districts where he got 60 and 70% of the vote, those House members said, Mr. President, you're great. I'm not going to give you my vote.
And that's one question I am told by a couple members of Congress that he would ask them, the president would ask them when they were inside the Oval Office, how much did I win your district by? How much did I win your district by? And they were sort of like, let's talk about the bill, Mr. President. Let's talk about the bill, Mr. President. He was not focused on the details here. But at the end of the day, the consequences of defying him in the short term appear to be not much. But it's a long game here. We don't know.
It's a long game. It's a long game. But this is the point I'm trying to figure out. What did he learn from this? Because you mentioned these meetings. One of the things we know from all the great reporting people have done in these meetings is the president would tell the members of the Freedom Caucus, conservative members who don't believe in a big federal government, who really want to repeal Obamacare. They're not all that interested in a federal role in replacing Obamacare. The president would say, I don't want to focus on the little, I'll say stuff. It's 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. He did not say stuff. I don't want to focus on that. You cannot pass something as complicated as health care and something that divides your party as much as something like health care, and tax reform is next, and then trade and all these, without focusing on the little stuff. That's his job.
Yeah, and he never seemed personally invested in this bill. Not really barnstorming the country as some thought he would, is to draw public support for it, get behind this bill. He, of course, didn't want to call it Trump Care. This was a bill that was written by members of Congress. This is much different than President Obama, who really was personally invested in healthcare, did that joint address to Congress in 2009, of course, the famous one where the Republican Congressman Joe Wilson said, "You lie," and he owned it, even though it was incredibly unpopular, Obamacare was at the time of passage. But Donald Trump never seemed fully to embrace this proposal, even though he did support it. And that made it really hard for a lot of the members to get behind it, too, knowing that that was the case.
He gave just very slight applause for it, very polite applause for it at the beginning. It wasn't, until a couple days that he gave a really full-throated endorsement of it.
Well, we know he likes winning, and this is what's happening. This is yesterday morning. This is in central Pennsylvania, one of those places Donald Trump surprised everybody, a blue state area where Donald Trump won. The headline's pretty bad. Obamacare repeal fails, and then you talk about healthcare will stay with Trump. This is Arizona, another red state. GOP pulls its plan to kill Obamacare, the first line of this story, in a humiliating failure. Donald Trump doesn't like this. So back to the lessons. You heard at the opening of the show, he said, I learned a lot about loyalty. Well, right after, at that very same event, he said, I like Speaker Ryan. Speaker Ryan's working very hard. Speaker Ryan has to deal with all these factions in the Republican Party. Then yesterday, the president tweets, tune into Fox News last night at 9 o'clock. Everybody says, oh, is he going to call in and do an interview? Oh, does Judge Jeanine have some exclusive on Donald Trump? Watch.
Paul Ryan needs to step down as Speaker of the House. The reason? He failed to deliver the votes on his health care bill.
What?
I mean, so the President of the United States is giving a preview. Obviously, he knew what was going to be broadcast last evening. There's no question the relationship between the President and the Speaker was never very good. Now it's a fractured, but the reality is they have to work together, at least for the short term here. But in terms of lessons learned, you don't learn lessons by assigning blame. Even before this bill failed on Friday, starting Thursday evening, the White House was already saying, oh, it's Paul Ryan's fault, it's the Speaker's fault. The blame game up and down Pennsylvania Avenue on Friday was extraordinary, and that is not how you learn lessons to go forward here. So I think unless there's any self-reflection, not sure what you learned.
Yeah, out of the White House, we heard it's the Speaker's fault.
Right.
It's Pelosi and Schumer's fault straight from the president. Then they started talking about why was Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, out of town? He was on spring break with his kids out skiing. They were blaming everybody except for looking in the mirror and saying that, we didn't do this. The president didn't do this right. But the question is, where do we go from here? Because the president, essentially, he said, look, Obamacare is going to explode this year. He uses explode. Others use implode. He's the fire chief now. Yes, Obamacare was put in place in the previous administration, but you can't show up at a fire and say, oh, that one started under the last guy, I'm not going to put it out. Or can he?
Yeah, no, he's got a few choices. One is, this seems impossible given the rhetoric of the last couple of days, but one is to actually pivot and attempt to work with Democrats. I'm not sure why Democrats would do that given his standing in the polls now.
They won't.
And given the fact that he says this is really Schumer and Pelosi are the losers. But that could be an option. But to do that, you'd have to decide you're going to actually save Obamacare, rebrand it, call it something different, or really mend fences with the Republicans and try to take a leadership role in bringing that caucus together, which is also hard to do if you're playing the blame game.